You've been following the news, I'm sure, and the possibility of peace talks, well, it's definitely caught people's attention. But what might not be immediately clear is just how complex things are behind the scenes.
Absolutely. It's never straightforward.
We've looked into a number of reports that really, shed some light on these complexities, starting with this feeling maybe that the U.S. might be shifting its main focus.
Yeah, potentially towards regions like the Middle East. And that possibility alone, well, it introduces a lot of uncertainty, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests the whole strategic picture is being reevaluated.
Which obviously has big implications for everyone involved.
Okay, so that leads us to that recent trip to Paris. Some European papers were framing it as maybe trying to guide U.S. thinking.
Right. But our understanding from what we've gathered is that Mark Rubio and Envoy Witkoff were there with, well, a different goal.
Okay.
More about influencing European actions, actually, encouraging a bit more caution, perhaps, regarding further escalation.
Interesting. So maybe a bit of a difference in strategic thinking between the U.S. and some European allies.
It certainly seems possible. The U.S. trying to shape Europe's approach. It shows how important they see controlling the direction of this.
And on top of that, we're hearing reports about debates inside the White House itself, about European troops potentially going to Ukraine.
Yes, and apparently there was even talk, a suggestion, that military intelligence aid to Kiev might be impacted if France, for instance, pushed ahead against U.S. wishes.
Wow. That points to some serious internal tensions and, well, high stakes.
Definitely. Disagreement within the administration itself always raises questions about consensus and how much leverage they're willing to use, even with allies.
So despite Zelensky himself having some, let's say, pointed criticisms of Witkoff previously,
Very public ones, yeah.
they did end up meeting with Ukrainian representatives, and the main topic...
A full and unconditional ceasefire. That was pitched as the first step towards a lasting peace.
Right. Of course, you hear statements like that, and there's always a degree of, well, skepticism.
Understandably, given past experiences. But the focus on unconditional ceasefire as step one, that's significant.
And speaking of intentions, there's this memorandum about mineral resources that popped up, described as pretty broad, sort of general principles, lacking concrete details, almost like a wish list.
Exactly. For all good, against all bad, give us your resources kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, a memo like that, especially with the specifics, often just sets the stage, groundwork for maybe more detailed talks later. But it leaves a lot open.
Now, Yermak apparently described these talks as an unusual format. He mentioned decisive German, British, and French partners.
Okay.
But the unusual part, Yermak was apparently in a suit.
A suit, right. That is a shift from the usual wartime attire.
Exactly. And notably, Zelensky wasn't at these talks, which puts Yermak right in the middle of it.
And there's speculation, isn't there, that maybe Zelensky's absence was linked to concerns about his interactions with U.S. officials.
That's part of the chatter. And Yermak's suit could be symbolic, maybe suggesting a move towards a more diplomatic phase.
Plausible. And Yermak being the key figure there certainly makes you wonder about the internal dynamics in Kiev.
And digging into that a bit more, there's also buzz that Yermak might have his own reasons. Maybe seeking personal security guarantees?
That adds another layer, doesn't it? A personal motivation potentially influencing these really high-level negotiations.
Okay, let's shift to France's view. As hosts, they publicly suggested, strong alignment with President Trump on ending the war, getting a lasting peace.
Right, the public face often emphasizes unity.
But what's being said privately apparently paints a more complicated picture.
That's pretty standard in international relations, that contrast between public statements and private discussions. Different audiences, different messages.
And Witkoff. He also clarified those earlier controversial comments he made about potentially ceding territory.
Yes. He sort of refined it, said it wouldn't be entire regions, but just the occupied areas.
The ones with mostly Russian-speaking populations.
Right. Implying perhaps that those areas are seen as less vital to Ukraine. It seems based on an assumption that Ukraine is primarily Ukrainian-speaking, which is complex in itself.
It's a very sensitive point. But his clarification attempts to navigate that.
It does, but it still gets to the heart of the challenges around territory and demographics.
And the Wall Street Journal pointed out a potential bind for Zelensky here.
Richard?
Having to possibly choose between keeping U.S. support and maintaining his domestic approval, especially if the White House pressures him on territory concessions.
That really highlights the tightrope Zelensky has to walk, balancing international talks with politics back home.
This also seems connected to that pause in U.S. aid earlier, right? Which happened around the same time Ukraine had a setback near Kursk.
That timing, yes.
Yeah.
The aid pause plus the setback. It could certainly affect Ukraine's leverage in any discussion about trading territory.
Makes sense. Now, interestingly, maybe Ukrainian public opinion isn't Zelensky's biggest worry right now, because elections are postponed indefinitely.
That's a factor, certainly. It gives him perhaps a bit more room politically, domestically at least.
But that itself is apparently something the U.S. isn't thrilled about. Reports suggest the U.S. favors holding elections.
Right, another point of divergence. The timing of democratic processes seems to be a sticking point between Kiev and Washington.
So Zelensky's public line on territory is still firm. No talks before a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, he insists occupied lands will never be recognized as Russian.
Which could be read as a sort of de facto concession, maybe? Accepting the reality on the ground for now, without giving formal recognition.
A pragmatic approach, perhaps. Maintain the principle long term.
Potentially. Now, Zelensky also has a condition for a ceasefire.
He does. He wants tough U.S. sanctions against Russia first.
But that clashes with President Trump's current position, doesn't it? He seems reluctant to impose new sanctions now.
Yeah, reportedly fears it could make Russia walk away from the table entirely.
So a clear difference in strategy there.
Mm-hmm.
How best to pressure Russia, or maybe when to apply pressure.
And there seems to be this perception, maybe in Washington, that it's easier to persuade Ukrainian officials compared to the Kremlin.
Well, that likely reflects different relationships, levels of dependency. Influencing Moscow's decisions is generally seen as, well, harder.
Okay, so this is leading to some frustration in Washington. And talk about alternative ways to get arms to Kiev.
Apparently so. The argument is, even if the U.S. doesn't directly authorize it, Ukraine will probably find funds elsewhere. Europe, other countries.
Right. But then the question becomes, who actually uses these weapons?
Exactly. And there's talk about potentially recruiting fighters from, say, poorer countries, alongside the ongoing recruitment inside Ukraine, of course.
That introduces a whole host of other complex issues, logistical and ethical.
Definitely.
Now, President Trump was asked about a deadline for Moscow to agree to a ceasefire. He said he's waiting for Putin's response by the end of this week. But reports say it didn't really sound like a hard ultimatum.
More like trying to create some urgency without slamming the door shut. Rubio, meanwhile, keeps saying big developments are imminent.
Right, he's been consistent on that point. But notably, Trump hasn't actually announced any specific consequences if Russia doesn't agree to a truce.
No clear, or else. And he's also continued making critical remarks about Zelensky.
Yeah, which seems complicated, especially alongside other statements he's made about Zelensky's responsibility for the war starting, which have sometimes seemed contradictory.
It does create a confusing picture. Hard to pin down a single consistent U.S. line on responsibility sometimes.
Okay, shifting slightly. With Easter coming up, there have been warnings issued.
Yes, for residents in places like Sumy, suggesting they consider leaving if possible.
And general warnings for everyone to avoid crowds during the celebrations.
Referencing past incidents, unfortunately, where civilian areas were hit during holidays. A grim reminder of the ongoing risks.
Very sobering. Okay, looking ahead, there's a meeting next week. U.S., Ukraine, France, UK, Germany.
But not Russia.
Not Russia directly in this meeting, no. Although Rubio apparently called Lavrov after the Paris talk, so there's some indirect contact happening.
That multi-layered diplomacy again. Russia's not in the room, but they're still part of the equation.
So it really begs the question about Europe's role going forward. Are they mediators? Or are they going to be expected to take on more responsibility, maybe peacekeeping or troops, at the U.S.'s direction?
That's a huge question. The transatlantic dynamic and how responsibilities might shift. That's key.
And Rubio said the next few days could show if ending the war soon is actually possible.
Right, but he also added that if it's not possible, then other priorities will take over.
Which echoes that earlier point about a potential U.S. shift in focus.
Exactly. It signals both hope for a breakthrough and contingency planning if one doesn't happen.
Now, Russia has put a condition on the table for a maritime ceasefire.
Okay.
They want their food and fertilizers back on global markets, which means reconnecting Russian banks to SWIFT.
And SWIFT is based in Belgium, and Belgium is apparently reluctant.
So another layer of complexity involving international systems and European hesitation.
It shows how tangled the conflict is with global economics and sanctions.
But in Kiev, the thinking is reportedly the opposite sanctions should be tightened for a ceasefire, not eased.
Right. which suggests Washington's position on sanctions might actually be closer to Moscow's than to the EU's view right now,
creating another potential split, this time between the US and the EU.
These differing views on sanctions are a major hurdle to a unified approach.
Peskov, from the Kremlin, he noted some progress, citing that moratorium on strikes against energy infrastructure.
Okay, a positive sign.
Well, he claimed only Russia stuck to it and said the truce is now over anyway, so suggesting those strikes will likely resume.
So fragile and short-lived, if it even happened according to both sides. Not exactly encouraging.
And Russia's UN representative, Nebenzia, he criticized any partial ceasefire, accused Ukraine of violations, and called a full ceasefire unrealistic right now.
He also raised doubts about the practicalities of a maritime ceasefire.
So essentially, deep skepticism from Moscow about current proposals, lots of finger pointing.
Underscoring the huge lack of trust.
Which brings us back to, well, not much tangible progress in the talks, it seems. Both sides kind of back where they started.
It appears that way. Russia probably doesn't see much benefit in stopping now, given perceived gains and maybe ongoing ambitions like in Sumy or Zaporizhia.
Right, where there are reports of a Russian strike force forming, despite earlier doubts about that.
Suggesting the fighting continues to be the main focus, as the conditions for a real ceasefire just aren't there yet.
Okay, but then there was this seemingly positive news: Ukraine signed that resource deal.
Ah, yes, the long-awaited deal. But it seems it's just a non-binding memorandum.
No specifics again.
Apparently very few. And the text is reportedly almost identical to an earlier framework statement.
So maybe not as big a deal as it first sounded. More symbolic.
It raises questions about its actual weight, legally and practically.
And one key difference compared to the old framework was pointed out. A clause is missing.
Which one?
The one that would have prevented states or entities seen as hostile to Ukraine from getting involved in post-war reconstruction.
Interesting. So leaving that out. Could it open the door for, well, broader participation in rebuilding, even from previously adversarial players?
That seems to be the implication, or at least one interpretation. A shift in strategy, perhaps.
Possibly aiming to maximize reconstruction efforts, regardless of past alignment.
The memo does mention Ukraine intending to align its laws with the EU for market access.
Right, but we've seen similar clauses before, haven't we? And they didn't stop the U.S. from imposing conditions later that actually conflicted with Ukraine's EU agreement.
Good point. So maybe this clause is also largely symbolic for now.
It highlights that complex web of agreements and potential conflicts between U.S. interests and EU alignment for Ukraine.
There are also some seemingly minor bits in the memo, like the U.S. respecting and thanking Ukraine for giving up nuclear weapons back in the day.
Which feels a bit perfunctory, like diplomatic boilerplate language. Nice girls, give us your resources, as you said earlier, and let's move on.
Pretty much. Now, there are also these reports suggesting Zelensky is being, well, replaced by Prime Minister Shmyhal for some meetings with U.S. officials.
The idea being maybe Washington prefers dealing with someone seen as having fewer political ambitions when hammering out deals.
That's the speculation. And the date, April 26, keeps coming up as potentially significant for some kind of agreement.
This change in who's in the room could signal a shift in tactics, maybe focusing purely on the technical or economic side, separate from the bigger political picture.
So the overall feeling is this memorandum itself probably isn't the main event.
Likely not. And any real binding agreement might not even be made public right away, at least not to Ukrainians.
So the memo might just be the U.S. staking out its interests preliminarily.
That's one possibility. Setting the stage, securing certain positions before the actual deal is finalized, perhaps behind closed doors.
And speaking of potential deals, there's this rumor that the U.S. might have lowered its compensation demand from Ukraine.
Oh, from the $300 billion figure sometimes mentioned.
Down to $100 billion, reportedly, which could potentially allow Ukraine to actually profit from whatever deal this involves.
That's a massive shift financially. If Ukraine agreed, it could completely redefine past aid as a loan.
And would other countries then demand similar terms for their aid?
That's the potential knock-on effect. It could set a huge precedent.
And all this seems to fly in the face of Zelensky's past statements, right? About never acknowledging debt to the U.S.
It does. It draws a parallel, perhaps, with his stance on never recognizing Russian-controlled lands.
Suggesting both positions might be flexible, depending on the circumstances and pressures.
It certainly highlights how stated positions can evolve when faced with shifting realities.
So wrapping this up, what we're really seeing is a situation that is just incredibly complex, constantly shifting.
Absolutely. What looks like progress on the surface often hides these deeper layers of competing interests, strategic moves.
It's a lot to track.
Indeed.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.